Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are once again in Music Spacing the Finale Frontier. We are talking about measure widths and minimum distances today, and in the document options, what we're looking at is the bottom section here. There's only 4 options: minimum and maximum measure width, distance between items, and distance between note with ties. Again, only 4 options, but there's quite a lot to it, so buckle up and enjoy the ride. Let's start with the first 2 options, minimum measure width and maximum measure width, and those are kind of what you would think they are. These are the widths in which Finale is not going to allow the measures to calculate any shorter as far as the minimum or any larger as far as the maximum. Again, we're talking about horizontal spacing, right? But it's important to kind of understand exactly how Finale is coming up with the calculations for the widths to begin with in order for these values here to make any sense. Now, 0 and 6.25 are the way that this is set in the default document. Generally, it works pretty well, but there may be occasions to change these values, and if you are going to change them, you really should know what's going on. So here's what I have to say about how Finale calculates the measure widths. So the measure width is a sum of the base value of each duration in each measure, and those values are determined in the spacing width table, which I'm going to talk about in the next couple of videos. It has to do with the reference duration and the reference width, as well as the amount of leading space in a measure, which can be found in the notes and rests pane here. It's this value here, spacing before music, plus all the extra width allocated to lyrics, clefs, ledger lines, chords, and articulations if they are calculated in the avoid collisions of section, and space for things like accidentals, seconds, and unisons if needed, and any extra padding if the calculated widths fall below the minimum distance between items or the minimum distance between notes with ties. So all of those factors add up together to give Finale a specific width for each measure. And the way that you actually know what the width is fairly easy. Just go to the selection tool, select a measure, press the return key, and you'll get into the measure attributes window. And what you'll see highlighted here, this is the width that Finale has calculated for this measure. It's 1.47569 inches. And you can see that if you navigate to the 10th measure here, you'll see that it's different, 2.03472. That's with the 32nd notes, with the accidentals, the rests, and everything. And basically every measure is going to have sort of a different width based on the calculations that I just told you about. And once again, these widths will only be calculated after you run music spacing. Now, it depends on what kind of music spacing you run. I've been running note spacing to get those values, and you'll see that, again, my value for measure 10 is 2.03. But if you run beat spacing, you're going to get a different value here. In fact, it's going to go to 3.04. So these measure widths will change depending on the type of note spacing or beat spacing that you run. But back to the music spacing options here for minimum and maximum measure width of 0 and 6.25. In the end, it is slightly arbitrary because, as I said previously, Finale is sort of full justifying systems here. So, from here to here is a certain distance, and the Finale has to fill up that space. So the values of these measures are never going to perfectly come out to that. So they're going to stretch a little bit to make that width. And in fact, if you look at this 1.475, 2.0, 0.875, 0.875, that's not going to add up to enough value to get across the system. Of course, there's other calculations involved here, like the scale of the systems and all that stuff actually plays a part in this, so those values aren't even absolute anyway. But it is relative. The important thing to realize is that between measure 9 and 10, for example, there is a percentage of 1.47 to 2.03. There's a relationship between those two measures, which is going to make measure 10 a little bit wider. That's sort of the important thing to know about how this works. The absolute values are a little bit arbitrary in that, and in that sense, so are the absolute values here as far as minimum measure width and maximum measure width. Now, one thing to note is that, the minimum measure width here is 0, but it's actually nearly impossible, I think, to actually get a measure width of 0. In fact, if you look at these empty measures, you'll see that the value here is 0.875 inches. The reason for that is that even in empty measures, it's going to calculate the width of a hole rest. Even though this is a default hole rest, this is not actually a real hole rest, it's still calculating that as a hole rest, and it's getting that width from the spacing width table, again having to do with the reference width here and the reference duration, which is a quarter note, and then extrapolating the width of the whole note. And again, it's also adding the spacing before music value. So, at the end of the day, it's coming up with this value of 0.875 inches, which is clearly higher than 0. And interestingly, even in other time signatures, if we just change these two measures to 2,4, and just respace everything, you'll see that the width value is still 0.875. So regardless of the time signature, if you have a default hole rest, it's going to calculate the width as if it was a hole rest. Interestingly, if you actually put in half rests for up and down the score here, I'll just do this really quickly, and re-music space, you'll see that it got a little bit narrower, and indeed the calculated width is now a lot shorter than the whole rest. See, now it's literally only calculating the actual half rest plus the leading space and all that stuff. So it is possible to get values that are shorter than the 0.875 value. Sorry, I'm just going to go back here and set this back to 4.4. It is possible to get values that are lower than the 0.875. Now, going the other way, it's much easier to get minimum widths for the blank measures to be higher than that just by using the minimum measure width value here, right? So if we set this to a value of, let's say, 1.25, again, the premise here is that Finale is not going to let any measure get narrower than 1.25. So these measures being calculated at 0.875 are going to get rounded up to 1.25. And if we music space now, you'll see that indeed these measures did get wider and indeed are now set to 1.25 as opposed to 0.875, which is the value of the whole rest. So there is a little bit of an interesting manipulation that can be done with this minimum measure width value in that way if you wanted to do that. I should mention there is sort of one other way to effectively get your blank measures to be a little narrower, but it involves going into the spacing width table. And let me just, quickly switch this to eVPUs. It involves going into the spacing width table and actually changing the reference width. I'm going to talk about this more in the next video, but this is the base value that it's giving to the quarter note here. So if we actually cut this in half, say 42, then that means that the calculated value of the whole note is also going to be a lot shorter. So if we respace now, you'll see that these measures do get narrower, and they are now set to 0.49 as opposed to 0.875. Now, this is somewhat dangerous because changing the reference width does have other implications for the spacing of notes other than just the whole rest. So you do have to be a little bit careful when you do something like that. But that's another way to possibly change the spacing width value there. And originally this is 84, not 48. There we go. Just get everything back to normal. There we go. Now, speaking of the maximum measure width, which again is set to 6.25 inches here, this is also somewhat arbitrary, and actually it's kind of hard to get a width that wide. 6.25 is quite a lot. We'll just kind of check out what Finale is calculating here. 1.6, 1.8, 2.1, 2.2, bar 5, bar 6, even bar 7, which is the 16th notes here. That's set at 3.888889. So it's still kind of a far cry from 6.25, but it is certainly possible, and you'll see that the bottom here, I do actually have widths of 6.25. These 32nd notes with all the accidentals is definitely calculating more than 6.25. So by having that maximum measure width set to 6.25, it's actually crushing these notes a little bit. So that's actually not good. But if we change this to 9 and hit apply and respace, you'll see that now it's given enough room because the actual width that Finale wants to calculate for that is about 8.08. So you can see that by changing that maximum measure width, you can actually fix this situation here. Now, what that does, you also see that it kind of pushed the rest of the measures onto the next system here when I update layout. So it does have some consequences. You do have to be careful about exactly how you want to use that value. Now, there's some interesting things that can be done with these two values to give you some effects. Let me just go, once again, just reset back to normal. If you set the minimum and maximum measure widths to the same value, let's do that. Let's actually choose one at random. Let's just say 3. Let's set them all to 3, right? And press apply. We can guarantee that the widths of all the measures will be exactly the same. Now, doing this will have a different effect whether or not the systems are locked, like the first two systems here are, or unlocked, like the rest of the systems are. When you set the width to something like 3, again, all of these widths are going to be 3 because I've set the minimum and maximum to 3. So it doesn't matter what's in the measure, you're going to get a width of 3. Again, because of the way that Finale flows the music in unlocked systems, if you think about it, so these 3 measures are adding up to 9. And if you put another one to add up to 12, that's going to be too much for this particular system. So again, it's going to kick that next measure onto the next system. So that's why you're going to guarantee to have 3 measures if you use a value of 3 here. Again, everything is relative, so it is going to make all of the measure widths exactly the same. So this measure is the same width as this, and you can kind of see how the bar lines between systems actually will keep lining up like this. Now there's sort of a leftover, there's only 2 measures left, so obviously it's going to split it in half. Again, Finale is always going to full justify the system. So, but with locked measures, obviously you're saying I want 4 measures on the system no matter what, but they're just going to be equal widths. So no matter what you have in the measure, you can see how crowded it is over here, it's going to be equal to this measure, for example. So that's what happens if you do that. Now, if you set this to different values of the same width, let's say we set it to 1, you're going to get somewhat the same type of situation, except where the measures are unlocked, they're going to get really, really cramped. So now you have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 all the way across, and Finale saying, well, that's enough width to fit all of these on the same system. Of course, it completely, ruins this bar here. There's just way not enough room for this particular measure of 32nd notes. And again, it doesn't matter over here because even though these are set to 1, you're locking these systems to 4 bars, so it's just going to, equally spread them out. If you go the other way, if you say set these all to 10, again, the locked measures are not going to move because, again, you're just forcing all of these onto the same system. But you can guarantee that later on in this particular piece, when the measures are unlocked, you can pretty much guarantee 1 measure per system, right? So that would be a way to do that because, again, 10 fits on a single system, but 20 does not. So that's why you get the situation. So manipulating these minimum and maximum measure widths in these particular ways is an interesting way to get certain effects like this. Let's just go back to the way it was. Update layout. There we go. Now, all this being said and done, we can certainly override the values that Finale is calculating for these measure widths. In fact, in this measure here, again, if we just press return with the selection tool, we'll get to the measure attributes. You can see that it's setting up my maximum measure width of 6.25. But if I wanted to, I could change this to 8.1 manually and click OK, and you'll see that it will do that, and it will push all the other measures to the next system. And this is a perfectly acceptable way of solving a problem like this. In this case, I'm overriding the fact that the maximum measure width is only 6.25. This is still going to be set at 8.1. However, it's important to realize that when you do this, you do have to have the automatic music spacing turned off in the preferences here. Otherwise, the next time that you go into this measure with Speedy Edit to make a change, this is going to be recalculated as 6.25 because as soon as you leave the Speedy Edit frame, it will recalculate the widths of this measure. So yet again, another reason to keep this music spacing, automatic music spacing option turned off, right? So that's one thing we can do. And of course, even though I've set this, if I were to reset my music spacing, so select all and just run music spacing again, it's going to respect that maximum measure width of 6.25 value again and set it to 6.25. But this is actually a good way to sort of fix some of these problems I've talked about in previous videos, particularly this one where you have the accidentals from layer 2 just kind of colliding with the other layer 2 notes. If you look at this measure width, it's calculating as 2.2, but clearly that's not enough width. So, if you just change this to, let's say, 3.1, you can see that you can almost immediately just fix that problem. Just makes this one wider compared to the other ones around it. Yeah, so that's one way to do it. You can do it here, but this I think the fix I showed you in the other video is better for this anyway. But yeah, so that's how you can use the measure widths and the measure attributes manually to sort of override the spacing and the calculations that Finale is doing automatically. Okay, so then let's talk about the last two options in the document options here for music spacing here. Minimum distance between items and minimum distance between notes and ties. I'm just going to go over to EVPUs again just to make this a little bit easier. So distance between items. So this is literally, it's going to say I'm going to put 12 EVPUs between any items that are starting to get a little bit too close. And that would be things like accidental. So if we go here and look at the B flat here, or the flat of the B with the flag. This is an instance where it might be using that extra padding from the minimum distance between items to add 12 extra EVPUs to ensure that these items will not overlap. Now, in many cases, like between the natural of the A here and the whole B flat, there's plenty of space normally, so it's not like it would automatically add that 12 EVPUs. It's only when it's needed. Like there are certain scenarios where things start to get close. Like this is probably one of them where it does need that extra 12 EVPU padding in order to avoid this collision. Now, all this is to say that if you increase or decrease that value, you can basically get tighter or looser spacing. So if we change this to, say, 6 and rerun music spacing, you'll see that certain items just got a little bit closer, including, I believe, this B flat just got a little bit closer to the flag. If we go and change it to a higher value, so it was 12, let's make it 20, not 243, but 24, we can ensure that there's more space between items. It's sort of adding more padding. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to this, and I wouldn't recommend futzing with this too far. 12 is probably a decent number, but if you want to get a little bit looser, maybe increase it a little bit, or a little bit decrease it if you want a little bit tighter, but not by too much. I think you'll start to get into some weird results otherwise. And then the last option has to do with ties, the minimum distance between notes with ties, and you'll see this is set to 48, which is significantly higher than the distance between items. Basically, this is sort of to prevent ties from turning into little nubs. So if I were to actually change this to 12 and respace again, you will see that some of the ties will get really, really short, and they'll just kind of look like nubs, and you can barely tell that there's a tie there. Even these here, it's a little bit tricky to actually see the tie. So having that value a little bit larger, 48, sort of ensures that the ties never get smushed up and look ridiculous like that. Again, you can futz with this a little bit. I wouldn't go too far lower or too far higher from this 48 EVPUs value. 48's a decent number. If you set it to 40, you can kind of get away with a little bit tighter spacing, and your ties will still probably be okay, but don't stray too far from this value, I think. All right, and then that's it, except for in the version for Windows, there's one extra option at the bottom here, and it's called Use Fonts and Resolution From, and then it gives you two options, Screen or Printer. This doesn't exist on the Mac. It's specific to Windows, and as I don't have a Windows computer to test this on, I really don't have a good explanation for it other than what I can tell you the manual says, which is, and I quote, "These options account for the differences between the screen and printer resolution. Choose printer to ensure that computations use printer fonts and resolution from the currently selected printer, end quote. I really don't know what that means. I guess it has something to do with the difference between the printer and the screen resolution. And I'm not even sure if this is still viable. This might be obsolete with current OS versions in Windows, so I really don't know what this is. If you're a Windows user and you happen to know about this and you know what this does, feel free to leave a comment and let us know what that means, because I can only tell you what the manual says, and that's about it. So there you go. All right, so that's the whole video. Like I said, it's only 4 options, but there's quite a bit to it, and I think now you have a decent understanding of what these things do and how you can manipulate them if you want to. In the next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about this mini spacing widths window, which there is a lot to discuss about. That this is where the magic happens with the math. So yeah, look forward to that. And so that's it for this one. Once again, I appreciate you all joining me here today. As always, if you haven't done so, please subscribe, and I will see you soon on the next video.